Oh, well, happy Sabbath, everyone, and to those who are joining us on Zoom here today. And welcome back again to the Bible Biography channel. Now, in the previous messages that I've done up here, we've been covering lessons from the patriarchs, where we've looked at the three great patriarchs who are often grouped together: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, today I'd like to cover the next great biblical character in the book of Genesis. Now, one could argue that he too should go alongside of these three great patriarchs, and that is Jacob's son Joseph, whose story covers much of the latter chapters in the book of Genesis. Now, Joseph is no less a character in the book of Genesis than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, the character that he displayed in his life was quite exemplary with the help and power of God. And in terms of physical wealth and power, he would eventually become greater than all those three patriarchs before him. Now, Joseph's story is told to us from Genesis 37 to 50, and we find the story of his birth a few chapters earlier in Genesis 30. Now, according to my tentative chronology, Joseph was born around 1699 BC. Now, he was born in Haran in Syria, where his father Jacob was sent to at age 77 to go find a wife from amongst his own people, where Abraham had originally come from. Now, not only does he find a wife, he ends up with two wives, and through the deception of his uncle Laban. He marries both the daughters of his uncle Laban, and through these wives and their handmaids, Jacob would father 12 sons. Now, after Jacob served two lots of 7 years, or 14 years in total, for his wives, Joseph was born. Now, Jacob worked another 6 years for Laban's flocks before moving back to Canaan around when Joseph was about 6 years old. Now, Joseph was sold into slavery when he was about 17 years old. Now, after a series of extraordinary events, he would eventually be elevated to the position of vizier over Egypt at 30 years old, around 1669 BC. Now, 9 years later, following the 7 years of plenty and the second year of a 7-year famine, more extraordinary events would occur that would lead to the reunion of Joseph with his father Jacob and his brothers, and his father and entire family would move to Egypt around 1660 BC. Now, Galatians 3 tells us that there were 430 years between when Abraham received the promise of becoming a great nation at the time he moved to Canaan, and when the law was given at Mount Sinai. Now, Jacob moved to Egypt exactly halfway into that 430-year period between Abraham and the Exodus. Now, this can be proved from Scripture as well as the testimony of the Jewish historian Josephus. Now, Joseph lived another 71 years after his father Jacob moved to Egypt, and Joseph died around 1589 BC. Now, that year, the year that he died, was about 64 years before Moses was born and about 144 years before the Exodus. So from that fact, we know that the slavery of Israel was no more than a little over a century long. Now, the idea that Israel's slavery was 400 years long is actually a misunderstanding of the biblical data. Now, Joseph's mother Rachel was initially barren, but God intervened and healed Rachel of her barren womb. When Joseph is born, she says that God has at last taken away her reproach, that is the stigma of being barren. Now, her name for him, Joseph, expresses ongoing faith that God will bless her in the future with another son. Now, she calls him Joseph, meaning he shall add. She says that the Lord shall add to me another son. Now, it will take around another 12 to 15 years, but she will have one more son. Now, Jacob left Haran another 6 years after Joseph and his half-sister Dinah are born. Now, Dinah was probably just becoming a teenager when the debacle at Shechem occurs, and it is after this, when Jacob is on his way to see his father in Hebron, that Benjamin is born. Now, Joseph will lose his mother probably at around age 15, as she dies in childbirth while giving birth to Benjamin. Now, Joseph would have a special connection with Benjamin over the other brothers, as Benjamin was the only brother born to the same mother as him. Now, we know that Joseph was sold into slavery at age 17, so this means that Benjamin was probably only about 2 or 3 years old at the time that Joseph was sold into slavery. Now, Jacob had 12 sons who would become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, 6 sons came through Leah, the older of his 2 wives. 2 each came through the handmaids of Leah and Rachel. And the last 2 born sons, Joseph and Benjamin, came through Jacob's favourite wife, Rachel. Now, generally, the right to be the next ruling patriarch over the household and the double portion of the inheritance would go to the eldest son. Now, this didn't actually happen when Jacob passed these on to his sons. Now, due to the sins of the 3 oldest sons, the promise of rulership over the household went to the 4th born son, Judah. Now, Judah was the father, of course, of the Jews, and David and the line of kings which came from him were all from the tribe of Judah. Now, the double portion of the inheritance usually went to whoever was the next ruling patriarch. However, that did not happen with the inheritance of Jacob. Jacob surprisingly did not give the double portion of the inheritance to Judah. He would give it instead to the firstborn son of his second and favourite wife, Rachel. And that son, of course, was Joseph. Now, this was highly significant, as the double portion of the inheritance was not merely limited to the physical estate of Jacob at the time, but also included promises from God of great national wealth to Joseph's descendants. Now, the story of Joseph, other than the story of his birth, begins in Genesis 37. Now, Joseph was 17 at the time, and in verse 3 it states that Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children. It states that he made him a tunic of many colours. Now, following Reuben's adultery with Jacob's concubine and the previous actions of Simeon and Levi, it is likely at this stage that Jacob intended to pass on the birthright and possibly even the blessing of patriarchal rule over the whole clan after he died to the firstborn of his favourite wife, who was Joseph. Now, when people are given a title, they're often given special garments, and the act of giving the garments and the title is referred to as an investiture, or being invested. Now, the coat that Jacob gave to Joseph might possibly have been given as a symbol of Jacob intending to pass on to him the birthright instead of giving it to Judah or the other brothers. Now, the Hebrew word here translated colours in the New King James is pas. Now, Strong's, in defining this word, says, by implication, a long and sleeved tunic, which is translated in other translations. Now, the implication of wearing a long sleeved tunic was that he didn't need to work while wearing it. Now, the Life Application Bible notes in its commentary about this verse, most robes were knee-length, short-sleeved and plain. In contrast, Joseph's robe was probably of the kind worn by royalty, long-sleeved, ankle-length and colourful. This robe became a symbol of Jacob's favouritism towards Joseph, and it aggravated the already strained relations between Joseph and his brothers. Now, this special treatment that Jacob gives to Joseph over his brothers went over like a lead balloon with the brothers, who then begin to hate and envy him even more. Now, in part 2, we'll look at evidence that leans towards the possibility that a palace and statue found at Tel El Daba in the Nile Delta may actually be that of Joseph himself. Now, in the bottom photo here, you can see traces of colour that were found on this particular statue. And those colours you can see here are red, blue and gold, which ironically are the same colours today as the British royal family. Now Joseph dreams of the brothers and his parents bowing down and paying homage to him, and this further added fuel to the fire of the brothers' hatred of Joseph. Now these would have been vivid dreams. They were much more vivid than our usual dreams, and Joseph would have felt that they may have come from God, so he shares these dreams with his whole family. Now the brothers pick up on the obvious meaning of the dreams, that he is claiming that he'll one day rule over them, as does his father, who rebukes him, saying, "Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" Now notice here, it is not just his mother and brothers who bow before him, but his father as well. Now even if Joseph was appointed the next ruler of the clan, that would not take effect until after Jacob died. So this authority over them is not authority within the clan, but a wider authority. Now though rebuking him, Jacob, it says, kept the matter in mind. Now we've already seen that Rachel had died at this point in time, so who is the mother that is spoken of here? Now quite likely this is a reference to Leah, who now takes on the role of mother to Joseph after Rachel's death. Now Joseph at this time should have sensed the envy and hatred from his brothers, but unwisely shares this dream with the whole family rather than just with his parents. He kind of seems oblivious to the brothers' feelings and how the message of this dream will just inflame the envy and hatred of him. Now this is what we would today refer to as not reading the room. Now why does he tell the dreams to his brothers and not just his father, when he should know that it will only anger his brothers? Well, perhaps we see some youthful pride on Joseph's part, or perhaps Joseph is simply naive and not recognising the angst that his brothers have against him. Now this brings us to the first lesson that we can learn from Joseph. Be aware of when others have an issue with you and do your part to reconcile with them. Now, if Joseph was situationally aware, he would probably have picked up his father's favouritism was being unfair on his brothers, and perhaps told his brothers that he would talk to his father about it in order to help diffuse their hostility towards him. Now, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:23-24 said, "Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift." Now we should be aware of when others have an issue with our behaviour or us in general, and we should strive to be reconciled where possible. Now Paul said in Romans 12:18, "If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men." Now sometimes the other party won't do their part and we can't be reconciled, but we should at least do what we can to be at peace with other people. Now the ironic thing about the dreams is that the dreams are not just prophecies, but they also serve as a catalyst that sets in motion events that will eventually culminate with the exodus from Egypt. Now Joseph's dreams, due to the reaction they provoke in Joseph's brothers, will set in motion events that will enable the family of Israel to survive a future famine and provide the means for bringing Israel and his sons to Egypt, where their descendants will eventually become a large nation and ultimately be delivered in great miraculous power. Now at this point in the story of Joseph, Jacob has been spending much of his time in Hebron, where his elderly and blind father Isaac is. But he still has flocks up in Shechem, where he sends a number of his sons to tend. Now Jacob wants to know how the sons are going up in Shechem, and so he sends Joseph up to Shechem to bring back word. Now previously Joseph has given a bad report of the sons of Jacob's concubines. Now the sons have gone up further north from Shechem up to Dothan. Now you can see a picture here of Tel Dothan overlooking the valley of Dothan. Now, the other biblical claim to fame of this particular location is that this was also where Elisha was when he and his servants had that great vision of angels on chariots of fire. Now, Joseph's brothers conspire to kill him. Now, Reuben was okay with the part about casting him into a pit, or well, hoping to go back and rescue him later. Now, at this point, Reuben probably feels a lot of guilt and for the hurt that he has caused his father with his sexual relationship with Bilhah, and doesn't want to add to that. And the brothers then cast him into a pit. Now, as the brothers were eating, Judah, after seeing a caravan of traders heading to Egypt, pipes up and says, well, why kill him? Let's make a bit of money and sell him as a slave to the traders. So they do a deal and sell him for 20 shekels. Now, Leviticus 27:5 in the laws concerning Moses and vows, Moses estimates a male from 5 to 20 years at the same price of 20 shekels. A manservant was valued by him at 30 shekels in Exodus 21:32. Now, by the 5th century BC, the price of slaves, as noted in ancient Assyrian records, had risen to about 50 or 60 shekels, and to 90 to 120 shekels during the time of the Persian Empire in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. So if the story of Joseph had been dreamed up by Jewish scribes after the Jews were taken to Babylon in the 6th century BC, as some skeptics claim, why isn't the price in Genesis for Joseph around 90 shekels? Now, this argues that the story of Joseph is a real story and not just a fictional one. Now, notice in one verse the traders are called Midianite, and in another verse they're called Ishmaelites. So we see here a mixture of Midian and Ishmaelites in this particular caravan. Now, we see a similar mix of these two peoples in the story of Gideon later in the book of Judges. And the Midianites also mixed in considerably with the Moabites, as seen in the story of the women that Balak sent into the camp of Israel to seduce the males before the Israelites crossed the Jordan River. Actually, I should note here that well, you can see there in those bottom two photos, is the well that's actually at Tel Dothan, which you can visit today. Now, Reuben, for some reason, was away from the brothers at the time of the transaction with the traders going down to Egypt. Now, he goes back to the pit to rescue Joseph, only to find out that they'd sold him off into slavery. Now, rather than turning them in, sadly, Reuben goes along with their deception to make out as if Joseph had been killed by a wild animal, which totally devastates Jacob when he is told. Now, Joseph, upon his arrival to Egypt, is then sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Now, inserted in between Joseph being sold into slavery and Joseph's rise to power in Egypt is the strange story of Judah and his line of descendants in Genesis 38. Now, hopefully the chart which I've given you on the handout there will help clarify some of the complicated details. Now, Judah goes off from Jacob's household to some people he knows in the Judean foothills southwest of Jerusalem. Now, the impression given is that he's left the clan without Jacob's permission, though we later see him back amongst Jacob's clan at the time of the famine that led to them going to Egypt. Now, Judah marries a Canaanite woman called Shua and has 3 sons through her. The first 2 sons enter their teenage years. Is given a wife named Tamar. Now, we don't know the specifics of what he does, but is wicked enough for God to strike him dead. Now, one strange law that had a lot to do with the inheritance of goods in this culture was a law called the Levirate law. Now, if a woman became a widow without a son, the brother of the dead husband was to marry the widow and bear that widow a son. Now, Ornan shirked this responsibility and was also struck dead by God, leaving one last brother who was too young at the time to take up that responsibility. Now, when he was old enough, Judah failed to marry him off to Tamar. Now, Tamar, aching for children, then pulls a deception on Judah. Tamar pretends to be a prostitute, and Judah sought to have sex with her, not realising who she was. Now, as a pledge of payment, she took some items which he later produced when she was accused of harlotry, exposing Judah as having slept with her. And not only that, she ended up having twin sons from this act of prostitution. Now, Judah confessed to his sin, but never had sex with her again. But Judah would end up having 4 other sons. Now, what is not clear is whether Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, was the mother of them all, or whether she had died before or after the affair with Tamar. Now, Judah stated, "She has been more righteous than I." Although Tamar did dress as a prostitute, it was Judah who solicited her. Tamar was ensuring that an heir would be raised up to her husband, a responsibility that Judah willfully abandoned. Now, we don't know for sure what Tamar's ethnicity was. She may have been a Canaanite or possibly a woman from amongst Jacob's servants of the same ethnic group. Now, it would be through Tamar and her son Perez that the line of Jewish kings would be born from. Now, after and Onan died, Shelah became the oldest son, yet God worked things out so that the scepter promise of rulership over the other tribes of Israel didn't pass through the line of Shelah, who did have children, but through the descendants of the sordid affair between Judah and Tamar. It would be through the oldest son of Tamar that both David, the kings of Judah, and ultimately Jesus Christ would be descended from. Now, it's very interesting. This choice by God shows the humility of God in being willing to have his son be born through a line that had such a sinful, scandalous affair. Now, Tamar would give birth to twin boys. Now, a scarlet thread to indicate the first one that came out was put on Zerah, but then Perez, or Pharez, as he is also called, came out first. Now, his name means breach. Now, the name Pharez is also fairly close to the word Pharisee, as in the Pharisees of the New Testament, which has basically the same root meaning of to separate. Now, it was Pharez, or Perez, who became the firstborn, and from him came the royal line of David, the kings of Judah and Jesus Christ. Now, Zerah wasn't so honoured, but was this breach where Perez or Pharez sneakily got that honour at birth ever healed? Now, there are scholars who claim that the kings of Ireland are descended from Zerah, and then in the time of Jeremiah, after Zedekiah's sons were all killed by Nebuchadnezzar, that Jeremiah took one of the king's daughters of the line of Perez to Ireland to marry a local Irish prince which helped keep the throne of David alive. Now, such a union would have brought the two lines of Perez and Zerah together at a royal level. Now, we know that part of this line of Irish kings eventually led to the line of Scottish and English kings that ultimately led to the current British throne. Now, when Jacob moved to Egypt, Joseph was 39 years old. Now, how old was Judah at the time? Now, we know that Jacob married Leah 14 years before Joseph was born, so if Judah was the fourth born, he's probably no more than about 11 years older than Joseph, meaning he would have been about 50 years old at the time that they all moved to Egypt. Now, Genesis 46:12 indicates that Judah's son Perez, through Tamar, was already a father, probably in his late teens when Jacob's whole clan moved to Egypt. Now, we next pick up the story of Joseph again in Genesis 39, where we read, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And the master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favour in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he made him overseer of his house and all that he had that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. So we see here that the man who ends up buying Joseph is Potiphar, an officer and captain of the guard, who is a high official in Pharaoh's court. We see that God blessed whatever Joseph did. Now, no doubt, Joseph worked diligently, and God saw that and blessed the results of whatever he put his hand to. Now, as part of the wages for their job, certain Egyptian court officials were given land from the Pharaoh to derive an income from. The more the land produced, the more wealth that they gained. Now, it's likely that Joseph started off working in the fields. Now, Joseph may have learnt a few agricultural tricks from amongst the servants who worked with his father before he went into slavery, and perhaps offered to try those out in Potiphar's field, and God greatly blessed that part of the harvest. Now, before Joseph's slavery, his father Jacob would have ensured that Joseph was well educated. Now, that may have included knowing how to read and write and basic business principles to assist in the family business. Now, the discovery of such skills may have also prompted Potiphar to have him serve in his house. Now, given the positive relationship he has developed with Potiphar, you wonder if Joseph ever tried to get a message to his father that he was still alive and in Egypt. Now, Joseph must have demonstrated great trustworthiness in all his tasks for Potiphar to trust him as the overseer of his house. And God continued to bless Potiphar for Joseph's sake. Now, you have to remember that Joseph has been unfairly sold as a slave, but he didn't sulk and play the victim. Amazingly, Joseph didn't grumble about the terrible turn of events which had separated him from his family, but applied himself as diligently as he could to his duties, having faith that God would turn things around for him when the time was right. Now, this brings us to the second lesson that we can learn from Joseph's life. Have a positive work ethic, even in the worst of working situations like Joseph. Now, we may complain about our work environment, but at least we are free, unlike Joseph. Now, Joseph gave his all in good service, and God blessed him as he put his heart into serving his master. Now, two people can go through the same trials in life, yet one can be much more positive and joyful than the other based upon their attitude and reaction to those difficulties of life. Now, Joseph kept close to God and strived to be a good ambassador of God's way, even in the worst of circumstances. Now, maybe it was Joseph's example that inspired King Solomon to write in Proverbs 22:29, "Do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before unknown men." Now, if we show ourselves trustworthy in the way we do our duties, those over us will be more inclined to trust us with more. Now, Joseph has probably been with Potiphar for close to 10 years by the time that he is made overseer over Potiphar's household. Now, just when things are going well for Joseph, things then take a sudden turn for the worst with what happens next. Now, starting in verse 6 of Genesis 39, we read, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Now Joseph is a good-looking guy, and Potiphar's wife, not caring about any loyalty to her husband, begins to lust for him sexually and straight up asks him to have sex with her. Now Joseph, probably out of loyalty to his master, as well as fear of him if he weakened to such a temptation and was found out, resists the temptation. Now he probably hopes that she is reminded of her need for her loyalty to her husband as he speaks of it not being his place to do any such thing with her. Now he doesn't treat this sin as a small thing, but as a great wickedness. Now when we are tempted, we have to be careful that we don't treat sin as light matters. Now Joseph labels the act of adultery that she is proposing as a sin against God, not just an act between two consenting adults, and not just cheating on her husband. Now in Romans 5:13, the Apostle Paul said, "Sin is not imputed where there is no law." So, if adultery was a sin here, then obviously God had a law against adultery in Joseph's time, long before the Ten Commandments were given to Moses at the time of the Exodus. Now in Genesis 26 verse 5, God said that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now it's a religious myth that the laws and statutes of God didn't exist until God gave them at Mount Sinai. Now additional statutes and laws may have been given at Mount Sinai, but the Ten Commandments and many other laws existed long before the statutes and laws and statutes were codified at Mount Sinai. Now Potiphar's wife doesn't respond to the hint and continues to hit on Joseph. So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice." Now, though it would cost him dearly in the short term, Joseph stayed loyal to God and his laws and steadfastly resisted the sexual temptations of Potiphar's wife. And it got to the point where he literally had to flee from her to avoid her advances. Now, this brings us to lesson 3 we can learn from the life of Joseph. Flee sexual immorality like Joseph did when tempted by Potiphar's wife. Now, James 4:7 says, "Resist the devil and he will flee from you." Now that works well for almost all temptations except one, sexual temptation. Now we read in Proverbs 5:8 regarding the adulterous woman, "Keep your path far from her and do not go near the door of her house." Now Paul also tells us in 1 Corinthians 6:18 to flee sexual immorality, or to put it in modern terminology, run, Forrest, run. Oh, you gotta love this photo, eh? Now, following his comments about not lusting after a woman, Jesus went on to say in the Sermon on the Mount, "If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you than one of your members to perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you than that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell." Now, obviously, Jesus meant this as a figure of speech, not to be taken literally. Otherwise, we'd have a few guys here missing hands and looking like Cyclops. Now, the hand and the eye only follow what the mind wants to do, which tells the eye and hand what to do. The problem is what goes on inside of our minds. Now, Jesus here is telling us with some sense that we need to take drastic action to keep our hearts and minds pure. Now, with the internet and smartphones and other media and technology, there are more sexual temptations and easy access to sexual material way beyond any other time in man's history, and we need to be diligent to protect ourselves to whatever we may be vulnerable to. Now, I'm very cautious about such temptations in my own life. Now, with my laptops, I have found that software filters are far too ineffective at doing what I want them to do. So at the suggestion of my PC guru, I've implemented a rather radical hardware solution. I literally pulled out the wireless cards from our laptops and snapped the wires of the Ethernet ports, so the only way that I can access the internet on them is with a wireless USB dongle, which I have stored it somewhere else. But I am able to do most of what I need to do on the internet at local libraries. I also have browsers and certain other apps blocked or password protected, with someone else having the password on my iPhone and my smart TV. Now, it's a radical step I've taken, and it is inconvenient at times, but I have at least had peace of mind and knowing that I don't have to deal with that level of access. Now, I remember watching a sermon by a pastor who discussed some similar things that he has implemented to protect himself spiritually. Now, he said, people might ask, am I really that weak? He said, well, most of the time I'm not. But why in the world would I resist a temptation in the future that I have the power to eliminate today? Now, continuing on with Joseph's story, we read in Genesis 39, starting from verse 19. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favour in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Now, unfortunately for Joseph, Potiphar's wife has him framed by lying and saying he tried to rape her, but God would again turn the situation into good for Joseph. Now, we get the impression from Potiphar's anger being aroused that Potiphar believed his wife over Joseph. However, the punishment is perhaps a mild one. Such an offence could have potentially resulted in death, yet he is only imprisoned. Now, it would have hurt Potiphar to have lost such a valuable servant. Now, he may or may not have suspected his wife was lying, though he would have felt that he could not have sided against her if it was her word against his. Now, some of you here may have seen the excellent Time Life Bible movie on Joseph. Now, in that particular movie, Joseph was played by Aussie actor Paul Mercurio, who starred in the movie way back in the 90s, Strictly Ballroom. Now, Potiphar is played by legendary actor Ben Kingsley. Now, in the movie, Potiphar does suspect his wife and believes that Joseph is telling the truth, but without any additional evidence, he has to side with his wife and banish Joseph. Now, we get the sense that the prisoners had tasks given to them, and like he did with Potiphar, he did whatever he was assigned to in such a trustworthy and positive way that God granted him favour in the warden's sight, that Joseph ended up managing the other prisoners. Now, continuing on in chapter 40, we read, and it came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them. Each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they said to him, "We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." So Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup into Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner, when you're his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon." Now when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, "I was also in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head." So Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you." Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So we see here God begins to intervene in Joseph's situation by giving him prophetic dreams to these 2 servants of Pharaoh that have been recently imprisoned after offending the Pharaoh. Now Joseph shows concern for them and asks why they look so sad following their dreams. And it seems straight after they tell him their dreams, he gets this answer from God what to tell them. Now we're not exactly told how God conveyed the interpretations to Joseph. Maybe he prayed to God and then he got an audible answer from God in his mind. Now Joseph must have had hope that God was finally beginning to act to get him out of prison after the butler was restored, as Joseph predicted. But to his great disappointment, he would linger in prison for another 2 years. Now there's one point I'd like to draw out in this part of the story. In Genesis 40 verse 8, when Joseph is encouraging the prisoners to share their dreams with him, he says, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" Now when he later interprets the Pharaoh's dream, notice what he says to Pharaoh. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." Now in both cases, Joseph gives God the credit for the interpretations. He never takes the credit for these interpretations, but gives that credit to God. Now this brings us to the 4th lesson that we can learn from Joseph's life. Give the credit to God for the opportunities, knowledge, and help that he gives you to succeed in life, just like Joseph did. Now following on in chapter 41 of the book of Genesis, we read, "Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream." Now just when Joseph thought he might get a chance to get out of prison with the help of the butler, who was restored to his position as predicted by Joseph, he was forgotten by the butler, and there he sat in prison for another 2 full years before God chose to intervene. Now later in the same chapter it states that Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. Now the age of 30 years old is a significant age marking a certain level of maturity, and it was the minimum age for Levites to begin service in the tabernacle, not to mention the age of Jesus Christ when he began his ministry. Now, as I noted when I covered lessons from Jacob, Joseph's grandfather Isaac died a year earlier when Joseph was 29 years old. Now, God here begins to intervene by giving Pharaoh two very powerful and vivid dreams. Now, in the first dream, there came up from out of the water 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the water, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. In Pharaoh's second dream, 7 heads of grain come up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Now, dreams were very important in the ancient world, as seen here in this papyrus called the Book of Dreams, that dates to the Middle Kingdom period in Egypt. Now, Pharaoh had magicians on hand to help interpret such dreams. And Pharaoh told his magicians the dreams, but none of them could give a satisfactory interpretation of them. Now, at least the magicians here were told what the dreams were, unlike those in Nebuchadnezzar's court when he dreamt of the great image representing the 4 great Gentile kingdoms from Babylon to Rome. Now, Pharaoh is troubled by these dreams and can't get a satisfactory answer. And finally, the butler pipes up and remembers Joseph. He speaks up and says to Pharaoh, "Hey, there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams. And it came to pass just as he interpreted for us, so it happened." Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to the Pharaoh. Now, one interesting detail in this verse is the bit about Joseph being shaved. Now, we have examples of ancient shavers found in Egypt. Now, the Egyptian pharaohs were all clean shaven without facial hair, unlike the emperors of later Assyria and Babylon, who were always depicted with long beards. Now, the only beard that pharaohs wore was a clip-on thin metal beard called a postich, which they would wear with the striped headcloth that was called a nemes. Now, in addition to the pharaohs, the Egyptian priests were not only clean-shaven, but they shaved their whole entire bodies. Right now we're finally at the point where the life of Joseph is about to completely turn around, but that is a story for next time. We will break there, and I'll cover the rest of Joseph's remarkable story in part 2 when I come up next to speak. Now, in part 2, we will look at his stunning rise to power from prisoner to vizier over Egypt, which leads to the remarkable reunion with the rest of his family and their eventual move to Egypt. In addition to the 3 other key lessons we can learn from Joseph's life, I'll also cover some of the remarkable archaeological evidence of the Israelites in Egypt and what is very likely to be evidence of Joseph himself. Now, thanks for your attention today, and I look forward to covering the rest of the story of Joseph with you when I'm back up here next time, which I'm scheduled to speak on August 9. Thank you.